I want to stop down here very briefly to give you a new perspective. People will sometimes come down the Rose Farm lane, they'll walk around the house and things, but this is a perspective that Colonel Aiken got on July 2nd as his regiment has passed by the Rose Farm buildings. Because straight ahead, this is where the Union troops are. The Petrovians Brigade of the 3rd Corps has been massed in the wheat field itself, which is just beyond those trees. The 19-acre wheat field is some of the bloodiest ground here on the battlefield of Gettysburg. Of all the troops that fought here, there were nearly 6,000 casualties in the wheat field itself and in the woods around it. That's why it is so bloody. Very few other sites on this battlefield have that type of casualty count. And a lot of it has to do with the charge and countercharge that took place in the wheat field itself, but also the nature of the fighting in the woods around it. At several times, either on the east side of the wheat field or on the west side up here in the Rocky Knoll, troops closed hand-to-hand combat. At one point, 140th Pennsylvania is fighting against the 3rd South Carolina at a pace of 20 feet apart. You cannot stand there for 15, 20 minutes and just nearly annihilate each other and expect to survive. Both regiments suffer so heavily up there in that woods, and they're kind of forgotten about. But we're going to talk about the 140th a little bit later on, the controversy. But what you get from here is the perspective that Aiken saw as his regiment got to this point near the spring house, and the remains are right behind me over here. This is when they got their first volleys from the ridge line up there. And this is Tilton's brigade of the 5th Army Corps. They fire a volley and then they withdraw. No one really knows why. There's still some controversy over exactly what happened. They fire a volley or two and they start to pull out. What's left of the Petrovians Brigade, which started the battle in the wheat field, is spread out all over the place because of the thinness of the line. Petrovian had to peel off some of his regiments to send down towards Devil's Den into the Valley of Death and the Slaughter Pen, and others elsewhere up here into the Peach Orchard. So he's very thinly manned down there and winds up really with just one regiment, the 17th Maine. 5th Corps comes in, Barnes Division, the 5th Corps, they fight, they start to pull out, and as action then resumes again later on, and the fighting develops there in the wheat field itself, Caldwell's division, the 1st Division, the 2nd Army Corps arrives, and the fight in the wheat field is really, really on. I want to reread, though, a little bit of Aiken's account. And he talks about from the position of the 7th, we could see the successive lines of the enemy that advanced down the wheat field, playing the 15th and presenting their right flank to the 7th. What he's talking about, too, is being up in the grove itself and seeing troops advancing down through the wheat field towards him. As the fighting develops and they've held that piece of ground, the new brigade is going to arrive, the Irish Brigade. Who was here on my Irish Brigade walk? How many moons ago? Whatever that was. We talked about that somewhat. I didn't really get a chance to go a lot into the fight between the 7th South Carolina, 3rd South Carolina, 2nd South Carolina, and the Irish Brigade and 6th Brigade up there. We're going to try and cover some of that in just a minute. But as Aiken now is holding on up there, he's joined by the 3rd South Carolina, part of the 2nd South Carolina, and the 15th South Carolina, which is charged down this hill behind you, through the woods and into the wheat field. The fight is now on down here in this area. I had a good question earlier about, is this the way the land looked in 1863? It's about as close as we're going to get right now. There have been changes here. As far as we've been doing the battlefield rehabilitation program here for about 20 years or more, clearing a lot of these sites to try to turn them back into farm fields, and we established some orchards, fence lines, and things. The problem is management. And I'll be honest, we don't have a large staff here to manage the amount of ground that we're trying to maintain without destroying it by super active farming or something else. And we do lose some of the perspective because of tree growth, especially along the water banks, stream banks, creek banks, and things like that. So in 1863, this area is completely open. You can see all the way from the house down to the wheat field itself. And today, the view is somewhat blocked by this growth. I don't have a solution for this. Thank God we do have the adopted position program. Volunteers come in every year, and they do clear and cut and pick up trash and things like that around the monuments, memorials here on the battlefield. And I have to say, too, that our military groups that come here from the Navy, sometimes the Army, had a Marine group come in here, I think, 2 years ago. Those guys are like beavers, man. Would you clear out that acre or two of trees and like an hour come back and there's not a single thing there, not a twig, nothing. It's like, whoa! These guys are amazing. And I think it was 2 years ago or a year ago, we had a Navy group come in and build some fences for us, and we thought of a 4-hour project that had done in an hour and a half. That's how wonderful these guys are. Not just because it's duty for them outside of their military duty and protecting our nation, protecting us, but they also contribute the resource, and they really appreciate coming here. From this point now, we're going to go to the loop itself. There is a path. You can go on the other side of the creek over here, down across the fence onto Brook Avenue, and follow me up the path onto the loop itself. It means the 116th PA. If you want to try and go this way, you can, but I'm warning you, there's wire fencing and also mud down there that will suck you right down. So don't go that way. Okay, folks, we are up here on what they call the Rocky Knoll. We refer to it as the Loop, primarily because this is where the avenue loops around. And 1863, this area was much more open than it is now. There are photographs and drawings we know that none of this brush behind you was here. You can see all the way here to the Rose Farm buildings. This is a perfect position for Union infantry to hold this part of the line. And as Aiken and the 7th South Carolina advanced through that bottom we just walked through, they received their first volley or two, fired back, advanced, and drove these Union troops out of here. In the meantime, those troops of the 2nd Corps arrived, the 140th Pennsylvania primarily, got into the woods over here on my left, behind you, and that's where they got in this real brutal fight with the 3rd South Carolina as Aiken and his men then take over this hillside. As Aiken was talking about Lieutenant Colonel Bland pointing out this gallant enemy and this quite a sight, these men advancing to the wheat field. The wheat field is about 150 feet on the other side of these trees, which once again were not quite as dense as they were in 1863. As I mentioned earlier about field management, we're doing our best to make this place look like 1863. We can never really turn it back to that because we just don't allow hogs and everything else to run wild like they did in 1863. Instead, we've got visitors like yourselves that we allow to run wild everywhere, which is not a bad thing. Trust me, it's not a bad thing. But as Aiken here is on top of the hill and they begin to engage, Caldwell's division of the 1st Division, 2nd Corps arrives in the field. They deploy. The 1st Brigade goes in and on here to my left, 2nd on the right, crosses brigade on the other side of the wheat field. The 1st Brigade cross on the left, Zook over here on the right. Right down the slot comes the Irish Brigade. And everyone who was with me on the Irish Brigade walk 2 or 3 years ago remembers they advanced down into the wheat field, stopped, began to fire volleys, and then swept around the base of the hill, actually cutting off the 7th South Carolina. Somebody mentioned earlier about this bowl, I believe. It's this area down below, which is part of the meadow attached to the wheat field where the lane went up through the house that the Irish Brigade then swept through up this hillside. We return to the account that Colonel Aiken wrote in 1882. Word came to me that the enemy were forcing themselves to my rear. I at once gave the order to retire, and the regiment did not stand upon the order of going, but with considerable confusion, though no demoralization. We returned as far as the spring, very much to Kershaw's chagrin, for he could not endure the mortification of abandoning the field to capture, which his command had fought so nobly for so many hours. We reformed at the spring and rested under the consolation that the enemy were not able to profit by our retirement. We did not retreat further until after night and withdrawn from that portion of the field. This is a very mild version of what he wrote in a letter dated July 11th, 1863 to his wife. And he says, "We fought for half an hour or more and drove the enemy, but during my experience I have never seen so much damage done by both parties in so short a space of time. At 18 men killed, several mortally wounded, 16 have lost arms or legs. So sad, so sad." Return to the narrative, he closes it out. This is the open letter again to Kershaw. And he closes with, "I do assert with all due deference to those who may differ with me, at the wheat field was the most highly contested point on the entire line. Will go down in the future as one of the most noted portions of that bloody field. And rightfully so. Colonel Aiken, I think, was very clairvoyant about the way we consider the wheat field, this huge whirlpool out there with so many casualties. So who was he fighting up here on this hillside? The Irish Brigade. And specifically I want to talk about this particular man here, this very handsome gentleman, St. Clair Mulholland. Born in Ireland as a young lad, came to the United States, settled in Philadelphia, where he became so enamored and interested in the militia that he joined the Philadelphia militia and became very interested in military affairs. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he volunteered for service, raised a company, which turned into three or four companies, I believe, and he was later given command of the 116th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. The first major battle they were in was Fredericksburg, December 13, 1862. His regiment suffered over 60% casualties on that field, and Mulholland himself was wounded. But he returned to the regiment in time for the Chancellorsville campaign, and there his service was exemplary. His regiment saved a battery that was about to be overrun by Confederates. Later on, when they were withdrawing across the Rappahannock River after the battle was over, his regiment was the last one to delay the Confederate advance and follow-up, and for that he received the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was almost indestructible because he's wounded again several times, ultimately at the end at Totopotomoy Creek during the Overland Campaign to Richmond, but still returns to the regiment and leads it all the way through the end of the war, whereupon he receives a brigadier generalship as well as a brevet major generalship. After the war, he returns to Philadelphia and eventually becomes the chief of police of the city. Irishman, right? All Irish are policemen. He's in Philadelphia. And is an expert on crime and punishment, and is recognized as such. But one thing that I really credit Mulholland for is promoting the story of the Irish Brigade. At that time, in the 1870s and 1880s, there's very few others apart from Mulholland who was willing to talk about the role of the Irish and the Irish Brigade in all these great battles, be it Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Antietam, where the casualties and the dedication these men was so strong, and their willingness to give their lives for a principle, a country that they really didn't know very much about. Mulholland's the one that really promoted the Irish Brigade, and his writings and his speeches. But unfortunately, he never really wrote a heck of a lot about Gettysburg, except to complain about this regiment behind me, 140th Pennsylvania. And we're going to get into that for a minute. But I want to just give you a brief rundown. I'll pass this around if you want to take a look at Mulholland. The only thing we really have related to Gettysburg is his report in the official records. And the way he describes coming into the wheat field, after marching nearly a mile and the division being in line of battle, we advanced to support a portion of the 3rd Army Corps then engaged. The brigade advanced in line of battle, gallantly led by Colonel Patrick Kelly. We entered a dense wood, began to ascend a hill where large boulders impeded our progress. Notwithstanding, we advanced still in good order. We soon came upon with sight of the enemy, who occupied the crest of the hill, and who immediately opened fire at our approach. Our brigade returned fire with good effect. After firing for about 10 minutes, the order was given to advance, which the brigade did in excellent style, driving the enemy from their position, which we at once occupied. And that's what he's talking about right here. The Irish Brigade monuments are right behind you, and the monument, the 116th Pennsylvania with the flank markers is right over there. This is the position that Mulholland and his men reach. And what is significant about this? How many men were in the 116th Pennsylvania at this battle? 66. 66 men. After the loss at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, there were 3 companies, I think, or 4 companies that were on detached duty. He only had 66 men here holding this position. So, hey, you win a cracker. We found the position which our foes had occupied but a few moments before, thickly strewn with their dead and wounded, and here we again opened fire, the enemy having rallied to oppose our further advance. And that's what he's talking about. The rally is actually Colonel Aiken and his guys down here at Springhouse. I think it's after being driven from here. But they are rallying and reforming to try to re-attack and drive these guys back. Wait for a second. So he continues. Here we again open fire, the enemy having rallied. After being engaged for about 20 minutes and the enemy having been reinforced, the division began to retire in good order. At this time, the division was entirely outflanked by the enemy. As we reached the wheat field, they had formed a line facing the right flank of our brigade and formed along the edge of the field almost a quarter of a mile in the rear of our brigade. This field we had to cross in order to get to the rear, and doing so we encountered a full sweep of the enemy's fire, which at this point was most destructive. Many of the 1st Division fell before this fire. They took more casualties falling back through the wheat field than they did actually advancing to take this position. What happened at this point, after the 20 minutes of fighting up here, Wofford's Georgia Brigade advanced through the peach orchard, breaking that line, and slammed into these guys, driving them back in the wheat field. Joined by Kershaw, Anderson, Sims, everybody else, it was a melee to get out of here. And one story that sticks in my mind about this is General Caldwell, the division commander, was back in the rear talking to some other officers, and he saw these Union troops all of a sudden running out of the wheat field. And the officer said, "I think those are somebody's troops, your troops." And Caldwell says, "No, they're not mine." And he says, "I think they are mine." And sure enough, his division was collapsing. Most of the casualties occur out there in the wheat field. So in 1883 or 84, Mulholland comes back here to the battlefield of Gettysburg to stake out the position of where the 116th Pennsylvania fought, and he positions the monument right there. He's kind of chagrined, though. He sees an earlier monument just been put up the year before by the 140th Pennsylvania on the other side of the avenue. He says, "Well, I don't remember the 140th being here." That's what he tells Colonel Batchelder, and writes several times about what the 140th is taking their position and usurping the role of the Irish Brigade, and on and on and on. By 1889, when the state had now coughed up money for all the Pennsylvania units to put up monuments here, he was either further chagrined when he came back to the site where the monument was going to go and found there was another monument going right here, the 140th Pennsylvania. It made him mad enough that the 140th put on their monument the right of the 1st Division, 2nd Corps, July 2nd, 1863, when, hey, I was on the right. We were on the right of the division that day. So the fight begins, and it gets really nasty. The 140th do claim they fought along the woods, but they advanced this point where they were again engaged heavily right here where we're standing. They actually were thrown back when the Irish Brigade arrived and the 116th comes up here. But still, this comes down to how these veterans fought over even a small inch of ground to make sure that their regiment was represented right on the front line where they felt they did their fighting. And not just here on the second day's battlefield, but on Culp's Hill, especially up at the angle on Hancock Avenue, on Upper Cemetery Ridge. These guys, our regiment was right here in the front line, right here in the front line. We weren't back there, you put us back, you put us in rear position. Well, Mulholland was really angry at this, as were some of his veterans. And he wrote John Nicholson, who was the head of the commission in 1884, that as far back as 1881, the 140th Regimental Organization selected a spot for their monument some distance to the rear of the line of the 116th Pennsylvania, and actually put their monument there. He's talking about the first monument of the 140th. This was the true position they occupied for the short time they're on that part of the field. It gets worse. We can see no reason for the post-bellum inspiration which caused the 140th to abandon the old monument and erect one in its incongruous position. The glory of that regiment lies down in the wheat field, whereon the survivors and their noble dead stood together in that terrible affray, where their blood hallowed and crimsoned the soil, and where Zook and Roberts fell, where the line of monuments to the memory of their colleagues of the brigade stand, and not on a distant spot where the survivors alone with empty cartridge boxes straggled after the fight was over. Them's fighting words. Holy cow. And then he continues. As the 140th Regimental Association have reopened the question as to the proper location of their state monument at Gettysburg, Survivors Association of the 116th Regiment deem it but just to them and to the truth of history that the Commission should require the removal of the new monument of the 140th, the spot that regiment really did occupy during the short time it was on that part of the field, and the obliteration of the misleading inscription, and we respectfully request that this shall now be done. It wasn't. The fight ended inevitably when Mulholland passed away in 1910. And no matter what we think of this guy, he was really a very fiery promoter of Irish Americans, Catholic faith. He served his country well, served the city of Philadelphia extremely well, and in the aftermath, he's only really regarded with high regard within the city. His daughter, who was 97 years old in 1986, 97 in 1986, remarked he was a kind and gentle man. I never heard him say a curse word. Of course, I knew he was a hero because I heard so much about him, but you know, when he's your father, it's different, and I was very, very proud of him. I think when we look back on the controversy between Mulholland and the 104th Association and the other events that went on up here, we can only be proud of these guys, that they survived and were willing to fight it out, at least for the markers and the men that they served with and the positions they served at. Our next stop, we're running short. We're going to go down here on the trail and talk about George Hillier and the 9th Georgia Infantry down on the trail towards Devil's Den. Try and keep up with Robin, the lady with the red hair. She's going to get us down there, and we'll meet you down there, okay? We're going to stop very briefly here. I apologize, this is tight quarters, but we're the lower part of Rose Woods. The wheat field is right behind you. We passed through the lower part of the wheat field. The field itself is about 19 acres of very lush wheat in 1863. And in the aftermath, soldiers looking from Little Round Top could see it was flattened, and here and there were small groups of blue and gray bodies laying all over that field. Part of that 6,000 casualties that occurred in this whirlpool around here. One of the most prolific riders and remarkable men who fought here was George Hillier. He had a remarkable career before the war, especially in the aftermath, and was here in 1913. Came back to address the veterans. I think he lived until 1920s. But this is this very handsome officer, George Hillier. Come you see, 9th Georgia Infantry Regiment. As the action occurred here and continued, his regiment came down this declivity behind me, here into the lower part, which was at the time of the battle, once again, was much more open than it is now, and right ahead was the wheat field. And that's where he fought, right at the edge of the wheat field. At one point, his regiment faced the 5th Michigan and the 110th Pennsylvania, were out there in the corner of the field, threw them back. There was charge and countercharge, but he and his men hunkered down here in Rose Woods, the lower part of the wheat field, and experienced some of that action that day. And I'm going to let Eva read his account and tell you a little bit about George Hillier. This girl won't run off.
Thank you. Okay, so George Hillier is born in Athens, Georgia in 1835. He's one of 8 children. His father is a congressman. He's going to have an active career in law and in politics before his Civil War career starts. So he is actually going to raise the Hillier Rifles out of Walton County, Georgia, and they are mustered into service on June 13th of 1861. He is elected captain of Company C of the 9th Georgia Volunteer Infantry. When they are here in Gettysburg, they're going to be the left of Anderson's line. Hillier's company, Company C, the left flank of the regiment. So while they are waiting here to advance, at one point, Hillier's actually going to witness a horrifying scene. He's going to see one of his childhood best friends, Jackson Giles, he's struck with an artillery shell, and he is thrown 15 to 20 feet into the air. And Hillier will actually write about this as he writes about his experience here in Gettysburg. He talks about how we tend to glorify and admire the generals and the officers. But, he says, it was never realized or even dreamed that we were to be actors together in tragedies like these, speaking of the boyhood friends who he'd marched to Gettysburg with. He will then find out later on the evening of July 2nd that Jackson Giles dies of the wounds he receives. As they are advancing across a wheat field, over fences, over rocky terrain, they encounter the enemy's line, and they say that they broke through them, losing quite heavily. He will write, after finding out that he now has command of the entire regiment, all the other field officers have been struck down, Hillier writes, I gave the command, attention 3 left companies, but the men could not hear my voice. So great at the moment was the roar of musketry and artillery. Therefore I ran to the left of the line, and touching the men on the back, made the movement known mainly by signs. In this manner the battle continued for half an hour or so, until General McLaws' troops came up on our left. After McLaws' division came up on our left, our line moved some distance to the front and down into a strip of meadowland where a brook ran parallel with our position. General Semmes was mortally wounded a few minutes later. We met with some losses, and the water of the brook soon became red with blood. But the enemy in front suffered far more than we did. We could not always see distinctly, so great was the smoke, but at intervals the smoke would lift, and we had a better view. In one of those intervals we could see the main line of the enemy that had been attacking us. It was so thinned out to amount, but to so little. This new regiment of the enemy came within 40 yards, and he says he notices that by seeing the color bear. He then writes, "That magnificent line of Federals lowered their pieces, and the volley came. The sheet of lead passed harmlessly over us, but I could see where the bullets cut and plowed the ground directly behind us. We were in this splendid natural rifle pit with every gun loaded. I looked up and looked along our line. The men rested their guns on the grass in front, and with the solid line of the enemy in easy close range, returned the fire. It seemed that not a bullet went above their heads or below their feet. They fell left and right. The line rapidly thinned. Some slight motion in the air lifted the smoke, and there was not one of the enemy left standing in our front. There was a long line of blue on the ground, so close together that one could have walked over them as far as their front extended without touching the earth." After nightfall, the 9th Georgia returns to the Rosewoods.
That's a description by Hillier, who's right here. Most run, which we just crossed over, the bridge, this is the old trolley line that runs through here, the bridge. The 9th Georgia is right back there behind you in these woods. This is where that action took place. And that regiment that he's talking about that charges them, and he sees the brave color bearer disappear in the smoke, was most likely either the 5th Michigan or the 110th Pennsylvania, which had charged to try to drive them here out of the woods. Now, the new line that comes in is, again, from that 1st Division, 2nd Corps group, Caldwell's division. This is the 4th Brigade under John Rutter Brooke. In short time, the General Commanding ordered me to relieve the 1st Brigade, which was Colonel Cross. I advanced in line, faced by the rear rank, which formation was necessary from the fact that it was not time to form by the front rank. Passing the line of Colonel Cross to the edge of a wheat field, we became at once hotly engaged, pressing forward, firing as we went. We drove back the first line of the enemy, capturing a great number, and charging the second line, drove it from its almost impregnable position to a rocky crest, which is right behind me. Our next stop, we're involved with John Rutter Brooke, Rose Grove, the fight there between he and Semmes. It's going to be right up here at the top of the hill. Rough ground to go up, take your time, don't fall, meet you up at the 145th PA Monument.